Welcome to today's deep dive. We have a massive stack of sources on the table today, and we are going to be covering a lot of ground.
A whole lot of ground.
Yeah. Our primary document is a historical text, the 1988 Covenant of the Islamic Resistance Movement, which is widely known as Hamas. But we aren't stopping there.
Right, because alongside that charter, we're looking at criminological research on general strain theory.
And we have Spanish psychosocial analyses of terrorism, plus comprehensive reports on North African foreign fighters, and international studies on the rehabilitation of terrorists.
It's a really broad spectrum of material.
It is. And the mission of this deep dive is very clear. We want to objectively unpack the ideological foundations outlined in this historical charter, and this is key, expand outward to understand the psychology of radicalization and the modern global efforts to counter it.
Exactly.
Now, before we jump in, I need to give a very crucial disclaimer for you, the listener. The sources we're looking at today contain highly politically charged material. The goal of this deep dive is entirely impartial.
Completely impartial.
We are not taking any political sides today, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints of the content we're discussing. Our job is simply to report and convey the ideas exactly as they are contained in the original source material. We are just acting as your guides through the texts, nothing more.
And, to really grasp the mechanics of any global conflict, you have to read the foundational texts of the movements involved. You just have to. You need to look at how they define their own purpose, how they constructed their view of the world, and eventually the underlying psychological mechanisms that make such a demanding ideology appealing to a new recruit.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to dive directly into part 2 of the charter to detail the movement's stated objectives. The document paints a picture of a world where they believe Islam has waned away from the reality of daily life. So the primary objective they outline is discarding and crushing what they term evil so that truth may prevail. And the ultimate goal tied to that is the proposed restoration of the Muslim state. But what I found really striking is how they frame the concept of nationalism itself in Article 12. Usually when we think of nationalism, we think of borders, right? Or shared language or a shared economy.
Yes, materialist viewpoints.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The text explicitly contrasts its own view against those materialist viewpoints.
Yeah, they view nationalism as an inseparable part of religious faith itself. It's not just a political affiliation or a loyalty to a specific plot of dirt based on where you were born. The ideology argues that their nationalism carries a divine factor that inexorably connects Earth with heaven.
Which fundamentally changes the stakes of a territorial dispute.
It changes everything about it. And even for those of us who follow Middle Eastern geopolitics closely, understanding their specific framing of the land is a crucial nuance. So if you were a university student, say, reading Middle Eastern political documents for the very first time, I would point you straight to the strategic importance of Article 11.
The Islamic Waqf.
Right. Early on in the document, they declare that Palestine is an Islamic waqf. Now, a waqf translates essentially to an endowed land. They state it is endowed for all generations of Muslims until the day of resurrection.
So it's a perpetual religious trust.
Yes, and the historical justification they lean on dates back centuries to the Muslim conquests of Syria and Iraq. The concept is that the land should remain in the hands of its residents to benefit from its wealth, but the land itself is endowed in perpetuity.
So it's kind of like a generational family trust. The current residents are just the tenants or the beneficiaries. They have the right to use it, which I think the academic term in the sources is usufruct, but they aren't the actual landlords.
That is a perfect analogy. The ownership is strictly one of usufruct, the right to use and benefit from the property, but the actual ownership of the land, according to this framework, belongs to the divine. And the immediate political implication of that is massive.
Because it takes negotiation off the table.
Exactly. The charter argues that because God owns the land, no Arab state, no king, no president, and no earthly organization has the right to renounce or abandon a single inch of it. Ownership is divine.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the charter doesn't just talk about high-level geopolitics or war. It mandates how the minutiae of everyday society should be structured to support this overarching goal. There's a massive focus on total societal mobilization, starting with education.
Article 16.
Yes, Article 16 mandates a heavy emphasis on religious precepts, studying Islamic history, and specifically cleansing the educational curriculum of what it calls ideological invasions.
And they blame those invasions on Orientalists and missionaries.
Right. It also demands that the younger generations must conscientiously study the enemy's potential, both material and human. It's essentially a call to militarize the classroom.
And that mobilization relies just as heavily on the family structure. The text spends time analyzing the role of Muslim women in Articles 17 and 18, stating clearly that their role is no less important than men's. But it defines that role with stark specificity.
Yeah, the phrasing is intense.
It really is. It states that women manufacture men. They are tasked with guiding and educating the new generation, raising children upon moral concepts derived from Islam, specifically in preparation for the duty of jihad.
The text also gets incredibly granular about household economics, which honestly caught me off guard. It's a political manifesto, but suddenly it reads like a severe household budget guide.
The part about saving money.
Yeah, it instructs women to manage households economically because, and this is a direct quote, money saved is equivalent to blood. The idea is that avoiding any waste is a prerequisite to pursuing their cause in such difficult circumstances. It's a level of daily micromanagement that really highlights the intense, unyielding nature of the lifestyle they're demanding.
You're picking up on a deep siege mentality present throughout the text. They view themselves as surrounded by vastly powerful, hostile forces. And they go to great lengths to name those forces and map out their influence.
And the scale of that map is sweeping. Later in the document, in Article 22, they detail the external powers they identify as supporting the enemy. The text claims this enemy used immense wealth to control global media news agencies, the press, broadcasting stations.
But it goes way further back in history than just modern media.
Way further. They claim these forces stirred the French and communist revolutions to fulfill their interests and establish clandestine organizations all over the world. They specifically point fingers at the Freemasons, Rotary clubs, and Lions clubs.
Which is wild to think about.
Right, labeling them as destructive spying organizations.
It's a totalizing narrative of history. It paints a picture of a global, centuries-long conspiracy against Islam. The Charter even claims these forces orchestrated World Wars I and II to wipe out the Islamic Caliphate, establish their own state, and create the League of Nations and the UN specifically to rule the world.
It's fascinating how a global, unified enemy requires a unified response. The movement outlines its relationship with other Islamic factions in Article 23, and it's an interesting dynamic. They express appreciation and respect for other groups, referring to them as stockholders operating within the same framework.
But there's a condition.
The very clear line drawn, yeah. That support and respect are provided only as long as those factions' intentions are sound and their conduct remains strictly within the perimeter of the Islamic circle.
And that demand for unified action extends to every profession. It isn't just about soldiers carrying arms. Article 30 assigns specific duties to the intelligentsia and media sectors. Writers, teachers, preachers, and media personnel are all told that sustaining the ideological war effort is paramount.
It redefines what fighting means.
It does. Uttering positive words, writing good articles, and publishing useful books are explicitly considered acts of jihad, provided the intentions are sincere.
Does this obligation extend beyond the individuals living there? What about the neighboring countries?
Absolutely. Article 28 lays out specific obligations incumbent upon surrounding Arab and Islamic governments. Because the Charter views the land as a divine waqf and the struggle as an unavoidable religious duty, these surrounding states are strictly required to open their borders to jihad fighters. The expectation is that the entire region must facilitate the mobilization to enable them to join the efforts in Palestine.
To really grasp the scope of this, we need to look at the movement's core ideological roots, which they actually place right at the beginning of the text in Part 1, specifically Article 2. They connect themselves directly to the global Muslim Brothers structure. They describe the movement as a comprehensive organization that touches literally all domains of life. It governs politics, economics, education, jurisprudence, and even art.
And understanding that comprehensive, unyielding worldview is the only way to understand their rationale for rejecting peaceful political solutions. Later in the text, in Article 13, they explicitly reject all proposed peace treaties and international conferences.
Which ties right back to the WAF.
Exactly. If we connect this back to the family trust analogy we discussed earlier, the endowed land, the logic of their rejection makes perfect sense within their framework. Renouncing any part of the land means renouncing part of the religion itself. You can't negotiate away property that belongs to God.
So international conferences are just dismissed outright.
Dismissed as futile exercises. The text argues that participating in these conferences merely appoints non-believers as arbitrators over Islamic lands, which is a fundamental violation of their core ideology.
They use every cultural tool to reinforce this uncompromising stance. I mentioned art earlier. Article 19 specifically outlines the role assigned to Islamic art in ideological mobilization. It states that true Islamic art is meant to address man as both clay and soul.
Clay and soul, yeah.
It's supposed to renew the spirit, revive the movement, and relax the soul for the long war ahead. It contrasts this with what it calls jahili, or ignorant art, which it criticizes for only addressing the physical body.
Everything is oriented toward a single overarching purpose. The movement's core slogan, which is found in Article 8, summarizes this perfectly. Allah is its goal, the Prophet its model, the Quran its constitution, jihad its path, and death, for the case of Allah, its most sublime belief.
Reading through this, it's just incredibly heavy. It's an exhausting, punishing worldview that demands total sacrifice. You really have to wonder, how does a normal person just going about their life get convinced to adopt an ideology that demands so much of them? Nobody is born reading a 1988 charter. There has to be a psychological process that paves the way for this.
This raises an important question. How do these rigid ideologies take root in the minds of everyday individuals? And this is where the psychosocial research from our Spanish sources provides incredible insight. It outlines how terrorist movements, regardless of their specific geopolitical goals, rely on social categorization to create a Manichaean worldview.
Let's break that down a bit for the listener. What does a Manichaean worldview actually look like in practice?
It creates a psychology where the world is divided strictly into black and white, us versus them. There is no gray area, no shared humanity. Psychologically, this framing does two incredibly powerful things. First, it inherently exonerates the in-group from any responsibility. Your side can do no wrong.
And the second thing?
Second, it culpabilizes the outgroup for all perceived injustices. They are entirely to blame for everything bad in the world. Once you internalize that belief, any action you take against that enemy feels entirely justified. It removes the burden of moral hesitation.
To explain why someone is vulnerable to adopting this black and white worldview in the first place, we look at Robert Agnew's general strain theory, which is heavily featured in our criminological sources. Agnew argues that every single one of us faces stress or strains in our lives. But certain types of strain are much more likely to lead to extreme behavior or radicalization.
We're talking about very specific conditions.
Right. Situations where individuals face strains that they perceive as highly unjust, extreme in magnitude, and completely lacking in conventional social control.
Context matters immensely here. Agnew points out that if someone believes their suffering is in the service of a higher cause, say, a soldier enduring a grueling deployment, they can usually process it. But imagine an individual facing abusive, erratic discipline from an authority figure or a state, and it feels completely arbitrary.
There's no higher purpose to it.
Exactly. There's no higher purpose to the suffering. It's just raw injustice. The psychological damage in that scenario is profound. They feel entirely stripped of their agency and dignity.
And when you feel stripped of your dignity and you have no conventional way to get justice, maybe you can't go to the police because the state itself is the one oppressing you, or you're living in a fractured society, violence becomes viewed as the only effective response to protect your status or identity. It's a radical coping mechanism, the historical charter we just discussed. That just provides the vocabulary and the target for the anger that the societal strain already created.
Which brings us directly into the modern geopolitical reality. We've seen these psychological strains and ideological narratives combine on a massive scale over the last decade.
The CSS study on North African foreign fighters brings our timeline right up to the modern era. The conflicts in Syria and Iraq inspired a massive wave of mobilization. We are talking about thousands of individuals leaving their homes, packing up their lives to join extremist groups. The Middle East and North African region is the major source of these foreign fighters, with huge numbers mobilizing from countries like Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt.
The challenge for these states is monumental. How do you stop your citizens from leaving to fight in a foreign war? They've implemented a complex mix of strategies. To stop the flow, they've used legal measures, like updating penal codes to strictly criminalize joining terrorist groups or receiving military training abroad.
Right.
They've used administrative measures, primarily travel bans and tighter border security. But interestingly, they've also leaned heavily into soft measures. Governments in the region have increasingly centralized control over mosques. They pre-approve sermon topics, hire and heavily monitor imams, and shut down religious spaces operating outside of state control to prevent radicalization at the community level.
Stopping people from leaving is one thing, but I read the section on the returnees and it feels like a looming crisis. The sources categorize these returning fighters into three very distinct types. First, you have the disappointed. These are individuals who bought into the pristine propaganda, sought a religious utopia, and found a brutal nightmare. They often just want to return to their families and escape the violence.
Then you have the disunited.
Yes, the disunited. These fighters still fully support the concept of global jihad, but they left their specific faction because they were disillusioned by the bitter infighting between rival jihadist groups.
And the third group.
The third is the highly dangerous operational returnees.
Right.
These are individuals returning specifically to set up local cells and inspire or conduct attacks in their home countries.
It's a terrifying spectrum of risk.
Which makes me wonder, are these countries actually equipped to rehabilitate these fighters? Or is that just wishful thinking on the part of the international community?
Right.
Can you actually undo that level of psychological conditioning?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, dealing with these returnees requires an entirely different paradigm of justice. This is explored deeply in the UNICEF paper by Rohan Gunaratne on rehabilitating terrorists. Gunaratne argues that simply throwing these individuals in a prison cell is completely insufficient. Punitive measures alone just don't work. Prisons often just become networking hubs for extremists. To truly stem the spread of radicalism, governments must fight on what he calls the battlefield of the mind.
And fighting on that battlefield requires a highly coordinated approach. The paper lists 4 required modes of rehabilitation that have to work together simultaneously. First is religious rehabilitation. You can't just tell a radicalized individual they are wrong or crazy. You have to use highly learned clerics to correct their theological misinterpretations using the exact same texts they claim to follow. You have to dismantle the argument from the inside.
Second is psychological rehabilitation. You have to address the underlying anger, the trauma, and those profound societal strains we talked about with Agnew's theory.
The third pillar is social rehabilitation, which is arguably the most overlooked. Think about it. When a primary breadwinner is detained, their family suffers immensely. If the state doesn't step in to support the detainee's family, the children grow up marginalized, angry, and incredibly vulnerable to the exact same extremist recruiters that took their parent. Social rehabilitation is about breaking that generational cycle of radicalization.
And finally, the fourth mode is vocational. You have to teach these individuals safe, marketable skills so they can actually reintegrate into society and earn a living. Though, as the paper dryly notes, you have to be very careful with the skills you teach. You obviously avoid teaching things like electronics or chemistry to someone with a history of terrorism.
Implementing all 4 of those pillars sounds incredibly resource-intensive. And the expert paper points out a very unique challenge when Western countries try to apply this model.
It's a massive hurdle. Because Western democracies are built on the fundamental separation of church and state, their governments are often highly reluctant to hire or deploy religious clerics to fight ideological battles. It crosses a constitutional and cultural line they are deeply uncomfortable with.
Which leaves a huge blind spot.
A critical blind spot. Gunaratne argues that this reluctance hinders the absolute most crucial element of de-radicalization. If a terrorist's justification for violence is rooted in a warped interpretation of religion, only a legitimate religious authority can effectively dismantle that justification. Ignoring the religious component leaves the root cause of the radicalization completely untouched.
You just traveled an incredible distance with us today, from unpacking the uncompromising theological texts and sweeping objectives of a 1988 historical charter, through the deep psychological theories of Agnew's strain and the black and white Manichaean identity, all the way to the modern geopolitical efforts to rehabilitate foreign fighters returning from Syria and Iraq. So what does this all mean for you? It means that to truly understand global conflicts, you have to look way past the breaking news alerts, the troop movements, and the political sound bites. You have to understand the deep historical ideological engines that provide the roadmap and the psychological vulnerabilities and societal strains that provide the fuel.
And as we close, I want to leave you with a final thought to explore on your own. We've established today that the true battlefield is indeed the human mind. We've seen that successful rehabilitation relies on slow, careful, one-on-one human connection clerics, psychologists, social workers working patiently to break down those rigid us versus them worldviews. But we are entering a wildly new era. What happens to our global security when AI algorithms begin independently generating and perfectly tailoring these extreme ideological narratives to isolated, strained individuals? If a machine can isolate a vulnerable person and radicalize them faster and more efficiently than any human cleric or state program can possibly de-radicalize them, how do we fight on the battlefield of the mind then?
Something to mull over.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.